Before I start, I really want to start with a celebration, and these four individuals who you may or may not be aware of, they are Banting and Best and Collip and MacLeod, and there's the dog Marjorie. And the reason it's a celebration is because last month was the 100th anniversary of insulin being given to a human, and Banting and Best and Marjorie discovered insulin. Collip and MacLeod were responsible for the mass production of insulin, and of course, we are where we are today only because of the work that these four gentlemen did. And insulin was given to a human, a young child called Leonard Thompson, for the first time on the 11th of January 1922. And you can see a photograph of him before and after insulin. And then as a young man, and he lived for several years before he was unfortunately killed in a road traffic accident. And if you ever go to Stockholm, I'd encourage you to go there. It's a beautiful city, and go to the Nobel Prize Museum. This is what you will see when you come to look at the 1923 Nobel Prize. Which is the insulin vials and, of course, the Nobel medal. But let's go back to diabetes. So there's an organization called the International Diabetes Federation, and every year they come up with estimates of the global numbers of people with diabetes and an estimate of what will happen in the future. And what you can see on this slide is what they thought was the prevalence at the time in 2000, when they thought there was about 151 million people with diabetes on the planet. And if you look over the next 20 or so years, they've come up and the numbers of people are rising. I won't say exponentially, but certainly much faster than it's not a straight line relationship. And if you look at the most recent data, you'll see that they've suggested that 537 million people on the planet currently have diabetes, which is about 10.5% of the adult population. But they've also looked at the prevalence and estimated that by 2045 that the numbers of people will have increased to just under 800 million people. So it's a big problem. But let's talk about the topic of the talk, which is about diabetes and surgery. So the first thing we need to ask ourselves is how many people have an operation every year? And this is extremely difficult to find out. And this group estimated that it was about 235 million people every year had an operation. And these were data published several years ago, including Atul Gawande, who many of you will know, who started the surgical checklist. Now, he and others in this group then updated their data back in 2015 to show that actually it was probably a larger number of people than they'd initially estimated, and it was up to about 313 million people across the world had an operation every year. In the USA, if you look specifically, if these are data from the Center for Diseases Control and Prevention back from 2010, and they suggested that if you did the calculation, looking at the population of diabetes, the numbers of people who have having ambulatory surgery, it was about 14,500 people per 100,000 of the population at that time. If you look across Europe, and there are data which is quite difficult because this is from 1986 to 2016, they suggested that the range was between 8,000 and 17,500 people per 100,000 of the population across Europe. And at the time, the population of Europe was about 450,000, which equates to about 37 to 79 million people per year across that 30-year period. Data from the United Kingdom, again, are more difficult to come by, and these are the only data that I could find published by the Royal College of Surgeons back in 2013, 2014, suggesting there were about just under 5 million people who had an operation during that year. But that's the absolute numbers of people having operations. But what about the numbers of people with diabetes? And this is where it becomes a little bit more difficult. Excuse me. Because it's not simply the case that the number of people with diabetes who are being referred for surgery is the same as the population prevalence. And there are a lot of very large, and I completely accept incorrect assumptions that I'm going to make in the next several slides. And the reason I show this is because these are data that was published towards the end of last year, looking at something completely separate. These are looking at low and middle income countries, looking at strategies to reduce surgical site infections using chlorhexidine or povidone iodine or coated sutures and different aspects. And what you can see here is that even though the International Diabetes Federation suggests in India, in China, in many other countries of the world, the prevalence of diabetes is really very high, the numbers of people in this trial with diabetes were really very low. And I read this paper and I couldn't quite see why there was this discrepancy and whether they were excluding people with diabetes or whether there was something else that meant that the numbers of people with diabetes didn't accurately reflect the population prevalence of the condition. But anyway, let's go back to the 2011 guidance. And what we did at the time is we had this little tube map of the patient journey. And I really want to focus on the primary care referrals, because what we did at the time is that we came up with a number of criteria that we thought were important for GPs to put in the referral letter when they referred for surgery. And as you can see there, those include duration and type of diabetes, who normally looks after their diabetes, what comorbidities they have, what treatment they're on, and what are their most recent measurements of HbA1c or blood pressure or BMI. So nothing extraordinary, but just things that we thought would be important. And what we did is we got 11 hospitals from the east of England involved, and I recruited surgical juniors to collect this data, and we looked at every single surgical referral to the 11 hospitals in the east of England for 1 week in August of 2014. And you can see that these are the hospitals that we recruited from, ranging from very small hospitals to my own, which is the largest in the east of England, where we had 751 referrals to all surgical specialties in that week. And when I say all surgical specialties, I do mean it. It was everybody. And so we looked at everything here. And you can see that the largest number of referrals was to general surgery and to trauma and orthopedics. And as you might expect, that it was the vascular surgeons who had the highest proportion of people with diabetes referred to them. And because these were surgical juniors, and I accept that they didn't really know much about diabetes, we used a cheat sheet. And as you can see right at the bottom, there's a list of all of the currently available medications that could have been used. And we said, if anybody's on these medications that's listed on the referral, then they must have diabetes. And of course, the only one that was different potentially at the time is metformin, which could have been used for women with polycystic ovarian syndrome. But otherwise, all of these other medications, the only indication is for diabetes. So what did we find? We found that during that 1 week across those 11 hospitals, we had 1,919 referrals. There was a slightly greater propensity for women to be referred, and a median age of about 53. And of those, 8.8% of all of the referrals was for somebody with diabetes. Now that's interesting and new data, because the population prevalence in the United Kingdom at the time was 6.2%. So already what we've shown is that there was a 42% increase in the number of people with diabetes being referred for surgery than the background population. And that in itself was really relatively new data. So extrapolating this, as I've just said, but let's make the wrong assumption for the sake of the maths and for the sake of the rest of this talk, that everybody who is referred to surgical outpatients goes on to have an operation. And I accept that that is wrong, but there's very little data to show how many people who are referred are actually then going for surgery. So let's go and extrapolate these data to the United Kingdom. So as I've said, 4.7 million people in the United Kingdom in 2013 and 2014 had an operation. So if you say 8.8% of the UK population had an operation, so 8.8% of 4.7 million is 413,000 people with diabetes had an operation during that time. If you extrapolate the data to Europe, so that data suggested that 36 to 79 million operations were done between 1986, I apologize for the typo, and 2016. And in 2014, the population of diabetes in Europe was 7%. So if you add 42% to that 7%, that's 9.94%, making it 3.6 to 7.9 million operations in people with diabetes in Europe during those 30 years, or each year during those 30 years. In the United States, if you look at the CDC, they said that the prevalence of diabetes in the United States in 2010 was 8.2%, and therefore 42% premium on that, so to speak, 11.6% of the surgical population had diabetes, which equates to 5.6 million operations in people with diabetes. Hopefully you can get the trend that there's a lot of individuals involved. There's a lot of people with diabetes, and if you extrapolate it again globally, you can see that this equates to about 36.3 million operations around the world. But I accept there are a huge margin of error. I apologize, it's another typo there. It's many caveats. Not everybody is referred, it has an operation. There's a large geographical variation, and of course there are many other issues that come into whether somebody has an operation or not, depending on where you are and so on. But this brings me on to really my final slide, and I'm going to talk about this for a few minutes. Now, this is a very busy slide. I'm going to take you through it quite carefully, but really what we're going to end up focusing on is these four numbers. So these are data collected from England across every hospital during the 4 years, looking at every single discharge. So everybody's data was collected by a colleague of mine, Mike Sampson, who was the former chair of the Joint British Diabetes Association for Inpatient Care. And on this slide, LOS is length of stay. So we've got on the left-hand side of the slide, the mean length of stay for people admitted under surgery, trauma orthopedics, general medicine, cardiology, and medicine for the elderly. And E10 is the discharge code for people with type 1 diabetes. E11 is the discharge code for people with type 2 diabetes, and C is the controls, those people who have neither. And these are the average length of stays for those people for these conditions under these teams. And on the right hand side of the panel, you can see the absolute numbers of bed days that were occupied by somebody under surgeons and trauma and orthopedics and so on during those 4 years, just in England. And what you can see is that there's an excess length of stay in people with diabetes for those people who have surgery and under trauma and orthopedics. And of course, there's potential reasons for this. And certainly when I was a junior doctor many years ago now, but it would be very commonplace for the surgeons to say, oh, you've got diabetes, we need to bring you in the day before for pre-operative glycemic optimization. Essentially what that meant was that everybody came into hospital for the day, was put into a surgical ward with intravenous insulin going and looked after by the most junior member of the team to try and optimize their glucose. And of course that was a disaster often. But what also this means is that the length of stay automatically goes up. And there's a very renowned health economist by the name of Marion Kerr, and she's looked specifically at the care of people with diabetes undergoing surgery, in particular day case surgery. And her data, which I haven't got on slides today, show that people with diabetes are potentially inappropriately denied day case surgery. And as many of you will know, that there is a huge move towards same-day admissions and day case surgery. And there are data to show that people with diabetes are not having the same equity of access or the same level of care because many people are being denied day case surgery for whatever reason. And indeed, I've looked at my own data from my own hospital pre-pandemic that shows that the length of stay over the last 10 years has actually gone up in people with type 1 diabetes, specifically because they are admitted inappropriately the day before. And the documents that I've shown you, produced in 2011 and 2016, and now most recently in 2021, do have some appendices in there to show what the pre-operative manipulation of people's diabetes drugs should be to prevent hypo and hyperglycemia if they were to come in for same day of admission surgery. So I would encourage you to go and look at those documents, because we want to try and improve the care of people with surgical care of people with diabetes, and of course prevent this excess length of stay. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I shall say thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions in a few minutes.